Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Puram, the podcast. Today we have with us Dr. PTR Thiaga Rajan, an MLA from Madurai Central constituency, and he is a third generation DMK Justice Party politician. Hello sir, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Right. So before we get into the actual politics, your grandfather was Chief Minister of Madras State, your father was Speaker of the Assembly, you were an academic. What made you move into politics? Because, and I ask you this not from a conventional tone, but like as an individual, like weren't you better off writing or solving problems of optimization? What is the pull towards politics in Tamil Nadu?
That's a very good question. Actually, I'll go back a little bit. My great-grandfather, or rather my great-granduncle, who was kind of the guardian of the joint family because my own great-grandfather died young, was one of the founding subscribers of the South Indian Liberal Federation, the precursor to the Justice Party, back in 1916. So at some level, the values of the movement, and when I say the movement, I mean the original Justice Party, social justice kind of developmental model type of movement, have been ingrained in me from birth. And in that sense, I'm actually a fourth generation Dravidian politician, though a third generation elected one. When my great granduncle had the chance to run for the Legislative Council in 1920 in the under the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, he declined and passed it on to his own nephew. Because he felt that Oxbridge educated kind of barrister was the appropriate representative for the people. So my grandfather was the first elected representative, both pre-independence and post-independence. He was an MLA in the 1952 assembly. Then my father was, and then me. I'm an only child, and so at some point, I think while growing up, it was ingrained in me that, like my forefathers before me, because we had been born well off, we were landed and had been for many generations before my great-grandfather even, that it was our obligation to put back into society. And, without any siblings, I had nobody to shift that burden onto. So I think for me it was not a question of why, but when. And of course, in the early days, I was a reluctant kind of expatriate. I didn't understand the world. I had grown up kind of in a cocoon. And so my father forced me to go overseas as a graduate student. Once I went there, I realized that I love to learn, at least in a more Western model of learning where it was more creative and more individual rather than rote learning as I had been used to in India. And B, that the downsides of being nobody, of being anonymous, were significantly lower than the upsides of being anonymous. All my life I'd lived in the public eye because of my family and my legacy. And so I really enjoyed it. And I found every means possible to prolong it and not come back. So in the end, I was only in academics for about 10 years after I left here, or even slightly less. I did many other things. I was in consulting. I did a bunch of work in the banking industry, and I kept pushing off when I would return. I had multiple opportunities. Different circumstances arose. Good ones, bad ones. For example, when my father died, the then leader of our party, Kalangir, offered me the opportunity to come and run in his seat and join the cabinet. And due to various circumstances at the time, I couldn't do it. My wife was pregnant. My older son was 1 year old. She was reluctant to come to India for the delivery. We had other issues. So anyway, long story short, I think when I did come to politics, it was the sixth kind of, I don't know how you call it, sixth false start became the true start, or sixth discussion led to the actual execution. So for me, I was always going to come back. And the only question was when. And, things work out the way they do. So I came in 2016.
So let me stop you there and ask you. So you have come into politics with this motivation of a long family legacy. What is your individual motivation? Is there like a policy proposal or a vision of society that motivates you to be in politics?
Yeah, I think, service in general is, I think, in the blood. But of course, then the question is, what are the values and what are the kind of impacts that you hope to have as an individual? I would say the principles in my mind remain unchanged. Going back to the founding of the Justice Party, a more just socially and inclusive financially and equality of opportunity society that provides for the upliftment of all. Those principles remain unchanged, and they are the motivators even today. I wrote an essay about 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Justice Party. And I wrote an essay which was published in the Murasuli, in our party's newspaper, and then became kind of the theme of the centenary celebrations that our leader, Thiru Stalin, organized. And, it said, looking back with gratitude and looking ahead with a renewed sense of purpose. And in that essay, I had said the principles remain the same. As my grandfather said, actually, on the 50th anniversary of the Justice Party, which Aringe Ranna organized after becoming Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. And at that speech, my grandfather said, men may come and men may go, civilizations, thrive and then disappear, empires rise and fall. The Justice Party as an institution will not live forever, but the values it stands for are eternal and will never die. So those values stay the same. The question I asked back 2 years ago is, how do we interpret those values in today's world? What are the kind of practical, structural, societal problems that we want to handle and we address, and what are our priorities? Why do we exist still as a movement? In some ways, the social justice movement has been reasonably successful. In many other ways, it has not. So I proposed back then, I said, maybe there are 4 or 5 ways we can look at it, because as a newcomer to politics, it didn't behoove my position to be the leader of thought. But as a proposal, I said, maybe we reframe the notion of equality and inclusion to include a broader segment of people, like Talaivar had been doing, the disabled, the differently abled, the AIDS inflicted, the third gender, the differently preferred communities. Maybe we redefine what a basic quality of life with dignity should be like, and that being the aspiration that we need to provide every person life of dignity, which includes things like toilet facilities, drinking water, a healthy environment, things like that. Fundamental policy to improve how we manage with the environmental impact of an exploding population and tremendous urbanization. What are our solutions to these things? And yeah.
These are extremely specific sort of policy questions, and we will get into each one of them as time permits. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you was, at least it's been my understanding that the Justice Party, because of its foundational, the people who were in its foundational days, primarily, whom we could call the Non Brahmin Elite, right? They were, while their commitment to social justice was absolute, they also had an eye on being business friendly, whereas the DMK moved closer to socialism. Is that a fair characterization, or would you disagree with that?
Actually, everybody has a different perspective, of course, on these things. But my own view, and it was shaped by a coincidence. The coincidence was back in 2012 or 13 when I was managing director at Standard Chartered Bank, and I was being promoted to a senior managing director. There was a leadership program in Oxford that Standard Chartered had an agreement with the Said Business School there. And it was called Leading Across Boundaries or something like that, or something to that effect. But it was held partially at Jesus College, Oxford, which was where my grandfather had studied almost exactly 100 years earlier, back in 1912, 1913. And I sat in that chapel, and it was a very emotional visit for me, because I went and I realized the circumstances back then was that the world was at war. It was the First World War, Many of the people leaving college or forced to leave college to go fight or volunteering to leave college to go fight were dying. You can see the plaques on the wall of all the classmates and contemporaries who had died in the war. And I remember thinking, in a time like that, how difficult it must have been to be non-white and non-British, to be an Indian. And then I started connecting the dots, and I said, why is it that, inherently many of the Justice Party leaders, as you say, were the non-Brahmin elite. But in those days, there was not a lot of business. Maybe there was a lot of trading, especially certain communities that were trading across the Asian and kind of African routes. But it was mostly agriculture. That was really the predominant way to be elite financially, was through large landholdings, certainly prior to the land ceilings of socialism and so forth. So what motivated such men, and they were mostly men, a few exceptions, such men who were born wealthy, who had the privilege of many of them being Oxbridge graduates or medical doctors or, highly qualified people, barristers. My grandfather was at the Inner Temple in London at that time, the elite kind of barrister training in. And what motivated these people who were already sitting on the top of society, who were the trustees of temples, to then come up with an agenda that was social justice, equality, reservation, nationalization of temples, everything against their personal, situation. Like, it's one thing if I'm the bottom of the pyramid and I say I want the pyramid leveled. It's another thing for me to sit on top of the pyramid and say I want it leveled. And something that struck me only after that visit was that, having experienced discrimination themselves, as they surely must have, however, kind of open-minded and equitable the walls of, Oxbridge were, surely they had to leave college and go to the inns and the pubs and the towns and the streets. And even today, you can't say that it's a colorblind world. So you can imagine what it was like in 1912 or 1910. And I think many of them, having experienced that, shaped their views, right? They were libertarian both ways. They were libertarian because of the values they learnt in the church-run colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, which is mostly what they were. But they were libertarian because, having suffered this kind of discrimination themselves, they said, if it can happen to me sitting on top of the pyramid, at least I have other recourse. I can buy my way out, or I can build a big house and not have to deal with it outside. What about the rest of society? So it was a very, contradictory situation where people were fighting against their own interests on the surface for societal good. And I think that has not been kind of repeated since. But going back to your question about business, I would never say that they were business friendly, because I don't think they really understood business as business. The Industrial Revolution had not really reached India in a large way, other than some, the British model particularly excluded value-adding industries from coming to India. They wanted to take the raw material out and do all the value addition in the home country, because that's where they could create the wealth there. And so there wasn't a lot of manufacturing, there was some. And what little of it was there was owned by the British. It was not owned, at least you had to have a British partner. It was very hard to be a purely Indian industrialist. But I think they were certainly of a mixed economic model. In my understanding of their economic model, they saw a distinct role for the public sector. They saw that the government should be the provider of essential services and goods, including and up to the free meal scheme, which they started in Madras Corporation when they tried to force compulsory education. They saw a very big role for the cooperative sector. Most people miss that. It was the Justice Party government that created a separate ministry and a separate department for cooperation, and greatly encouraged cooperative societies, from unions, from workers, from, residents, from farmers. My grandfather had been the Minister for Cooperation back in the 1920s. My grandfather and father both personally served as, office bearers of cooperative societies like the Majra Mills Workers' Society and so forth. And they strongly encouraged the cooperative sector, which, as you know, is in between the state sector and the private sector. It is effectively a non-profit mutual society. The cooperative movement was born in the 1800s effectively in Scotland, and then eventually were in the insurance business, where they said, at some level we need to have a mutual society so that risk is shared. And at some other level, we don't want it to be for profit. Nobody should benefit from the risk management of others. And so this mutual society model for insurance came up, and then they found it applied to all kinds of other things, right? Risk-bearing in crops, risk-bearing in supply procurement, risk-bearing in housing finance, etc., etc. So there was a very big push on the cooperative sector in the Justice Party governments. And then, of course, they always felt that there was going to have to be private sector development, because the motivation of human beings for profit just could not be replicated in government or in the cooperative sector. And at some level, that was an essential component of economic activity. Going back to Adam Smith, each man acting in his own interest gives you the most efficient outcome.
Where do you draw a line between that line of thinking and the DMK's current sort of economic policy? I ask you this because quite often we see a discourse from Delhi accusing both Dravidian parties of fiscal profligacy without realizing what the effect of social schemes have been. But the other side to that coin has also been that there has been over the past, particularly over the past 3 or 4 years, the revenue situation in the state has declined quite badly. So what is the DMK's policy now? Where do you see the situation of Tamil Nadu in particular going forward?
Actually, I'd separate those as two different questions. I didn't quite answer your question earlier, so let me get back to that. I don't think there was ever a day that the DMK, either under Aringer Anna or under Thalaivar Kalaignar or today under Thalaivar Dalavadi, has been kind of industry friendly. In fact, if you look back in the 60s, right after the DMK government first came, was when they held the first trade and manufacturing expo of kind of the region, which then, that exposition grounds is what became Anna Nagar, right? They set up in barren wasteland. They created a year-long exposition, international trade and manufacturing exposition. So the notion of foreign trade, the notion of production, the notion of kind of industrial growth, job creation, has been close to the heart of the DMK. In fact, about 10 days ago, there was a big event organized by the South Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry as a tribute to Thalaivar Kalaignar, in which the top 10 or 12 industrialists of Tamil Nadu spoke. And all of them talked about how much foresight he had, how he helped going back to the 60s with the formation of SPIC and so forth, how he was always a big proponent of industry, how he understood the value of industrial kind of output and job creation. And so I don't think the government's position on private enterprise has ever changed that much. At least, you might say the DK as a movement veered closer to, socialism or extreme socialism or communism. But the DMK, at least as far as markets and businesses was concerned, I don't think you can point to any part of its governance history and say it was anti-private enterprise. It may have been socialist in different ways, but it was never anti-private enterprise, and it was actually very supportive of private entrepreneurship. Mr. N. Srinivasan of India Cement spoke, the Ramco Group spoke, Mr. A.C. Muthaya spoke. Any number of industrialists spoke about how he had gone out of his way and the government had formed policies for industrialization. So I leave that as a separate topic. I would not admit that the DMK was at any point not industry friendly or not private enterprise friendly. Unrelated question, in my opinion, is the extent to which socialism in the form of freebies or government support or supposedly popular schemes has A, manifested itself in government policy, and B, the consequences of that for the fiscal situation of the state. So in that perspective, I would say, it is very hard to easily categorize all freebies or all socialist welfare measures as kind of financially profligate or irresponsible. I made this statement on behalf of the DMK I presented before the 15th Finance Commission when it appeared here. And I said, I personally have a view that there are at least 3 or 4 types of freebies. There are freebies like the noon meal scheme, which from an accounting policy we count as current year revenue expenditure. But in fact, in my opinion, is capital investment into the development of human beings. There are schemes like giving, laptops to college students or cycles to, school students or so forth, which again I would consider in policy terms as investments in the future rather than the accounting, model of revenue expenses. I would even go so far as to say there are schemes in the insurance space, like health insurance, or for that matter, marriage assistance. Because as you know, in developmental economics, when we study this, we say it's one thing to lift a man or a society or a family up from this level to this level. It's another thing to keep them there. And very often what doesn't keep them there is unforeseen events, or in some cases, foreseen large ticket events, like a wedding expense. Right? Of course, everybody knows they're going to have to spend on the wedding. But how does a daily wage worker or a 20,000 rupee a month employee, especially in a country where the banking system is not that efficient and access to credit is not good, certainly unsecured credit is almost not available in the system, you have to go to money lenders. In that kind of society, a wedding can be something that sets you back a decade. Right? You have to spend 2 or 3 lakhs, you don't have that kind of money, you borrow, the interest rates are usurious, and then you end up paying that for the next 5 years or 10 years of your life. So even the marriage assistance schemes, I would say, are social welfare measures that provide insurance from falling behind once you have reached a certain stage. Then personally, I can look at many schemes and say either they're just unimplementable or badly designed, or should never be touched in the first place. And I'll give you like 3 or 4 examples, right? Just because we're talking in detail now. To me, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is a fantastic scheme if you actually make sure that some productive work happens for the salary that is given. Of course, you want to give minimum, it's equal to giving a minimum kind of, income, in a different way. But were you to give that income when they did no work, you are, in the technical definition of the sense, creating inflation because you have pumped more money into the system for zero increased productivity. That is the definition of inflation, right? More money chasing the same or fewer goods is inflation. On the other hand, if they actually did something, and there's so much to do, like, desilting tanks, like pruning kind of roadside stuff, like supporting agricultural workers, like, there's so much that can be done that needs to be done. Then it becomes almost like the Great Works program of, the 1940s after the war, where Eisenhower's administration decided to build the interstate system, not because they needed the roads, but because they needed to provide employment. And in the course of providing employment, they built this fantastic road network that ended up transforming the economy for the next 20 or 30 years, because it was just such a, economic value add in terms of goods transportation, people transportation, cost reduction, time reduction, etc. It was a huge productivity boost. So there's a scheme which in implementation can go either way. It can be a fantastically good scheme. It can be a by design inflationary scheme, and not just that, it'll have second order, third order knock-on consequences. If I go to a rural area and I start paying people to do nothing, surely the wages for people who do something then climb dramatically. Then the cost of agricultural output increases. So in this case, it's not just hypothetical or theoretical inflation, is direct inflation in fundamental things like rice or vegetables which are produced from the rural areas where the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme works. Then you look at schemes like, in my opinion, the cow and goat scheme. Now, I'm a member of the Public Accounts Committee, so I see of the Assembly, so I see the audit reports. In my mind, these cow and goat schemes are not workable. Right? They are simply too complicated and require too many checks and balances to be practically executable. They are nice to announce, they're catchy, what we say in Tamil, kavarchiya, but they are not practically implementable because there's so many ways it can fail, and we see in the audit reports that it fails all the time. Right? Then you look at schemes, in my opinion, which are blatantly kind of, for lack of a better word, ill-conceived and pointless and, counterproductive schemes, like the subsidy for two-wheelers, for powered two-wheelers. Now, here you have a state that is running something like a 14 or 12 crore loss a day, operating a public transportation system, and not, where there's demand, there's not enough buses, and where there's buses, there's too much demand, right? Like in what do you say, non-productive routes, the government is not supplying enough support, and in city routes, there's not enough buses, right? So you have a system that's failing in every way. Instead of encouraging the development of that system and fixing it and spending your money on that, you start going ahead and doing things like providing free two-wheelers. How many people can you possibly impact? It is bad in design, it is bad in conception, it is bad in implementation. I'll tell you, they say they're going to help 1 lakh people. I mean, we are a population of like 7 crore. What are you going to do by helping 1 lakh people? What will it do to the average productivity? The subsidy is 25,000 rupees. That is a lot of money. The widow subsidy, the disabled monthly pension is 1,000 or 1,500 rupees. You're giving 2 years worth in one check. You think there's going to be corruption and malfeasance there or not? Of course, it's going to happen in droves. Then what you have another 1 lakh scooters and two-wheelers on the road in a place where there's not enough kind of road capacity for the traffic. So you're increasing congestion. Now, whatever benefit you're giving those 1 lakh people, the remaining 10 lakh or 20 lakh people on the road are already going to pay the price by increased congestion, and their productivity goes down, the traffic congestion goes up. Then you have environmental pollution. Surely it's going to be better if they rode in 50 or 100 buses instead of 1 lakh two-wheelers. So it is a policy that is designed badly, implemented badly, conceived badly. It is irredeemable in my opinion. And yet we have that also being done. So now if you say, are all schemes the same? The answer is no. Separately, I take it to a third level and say, are these schemes the reason for the deficit of the state? I actually have to think no. If you actually look at the math, the reason for the deficit of the state starts with number one, revenue mismanagement. If we had been managing revenues as the trend from 2003, when the FRA Act was passed, till 2012, let's say, it was the pattern. Today, the state's revenue should be about 25,000 crores more. So somewhere the system has failed in the last 4 or 5 years. It's only after 2014. I can point to this day that at least what the paper says, what the data says, the day that Ms. Jayalalitha's hands came off the tiller, the day she went to jail for the first time in Bangalore unexpectedly without having laid plans in place. From that day, the state's finances have deteriorated and gone through the floor. And we can show that mathematically. I've done it many times. And we went till that day, we had never had an annual revenue deficit of greater than 2,000 or 3,000 crores. In fact, the cumulative deficit of 11 years from 2003 was only about 1,000, 2,000 crores because the 5-year DMK regime from 6 to 11 had run a revenue surplus government. Over 5 years, they had run a 2,600 crore revenue surplus government. From 14 till now, the annual revenue deficits have plummeted. This year, we'll end up something like 16 or 17,000 crore revenue deficit and something like 40, 50,000 crore fiscal deficit. This is a recent phenomenon, and this phenomenon has many components, the freebies being the least of it. It is bad revenue management, it is bad expense management, it is bad interest management, it is excessive debt taking, it is horrendous mismanagement of the finances in every way. If this was a company, by now the market would have insisted that the entire board be fired. Right? We should not have these people managing the economy.
That brings me to two related questions. And let me first bring the 15th Finance Commission here because that is, of course, one source of revenue for the state. And I know that the DMK, and particularly you, have spoken quite aggressively about it to the commission that came to Chennai for consultations and to the central government as well. Firstly, let me have you state the DMK's objections to the terms of reference one more time, so that our listeners can get that clarified, and then I'll subsequently walk into other questions.
So I think broadly we had 5 objections. The first objection was that the terms of reference gave the Commission too broad a mandate and sweeping powers that were not justified in the context of previous commissions or the laws and acts that already existed. The second was that the requirement that the Commission should project forward for 5 years starting 2021. that they were expected to project forward revenues, expenses, outcomes for 29 states and the center, starting 2 years from now and ending 7 years from now, and use that as the basis for decisions of allocations, was just infeasible and kind of, too naively idealistic in our perspective. And just to give one point, I gave a reference. I said under the FRA and the FRBM Act in Delhi and the equivalents in all the states, the FRA is the Tamil Nadu Act, we are required every budget to do a 2-year forward projection. Right? Just like we do a retrospective accounting, final accounts of 2 years ago, preliminary account of last year, and then this year's budget and 2 years forward. Expected budget 2 years forward. If you look at the 2-year forward budget, forget that. Even if you look at the 1-year forward budget compared to the budget that is actually presented 1 year later, the forecasting ability of the state is close to zero. There are gross variations. In 2 years, it's almost like random numbers, right? The numbers vary so much. So my question to the commission was, when each state or the center is not able to project its own situation 2 years forward, and we have a 10-year track record that says that's true, how do you expect to project for all 29 states plus the center 5 years forward? You just think about the rates of compounding, right? India is growing, let's say, between 7 and 9%, and inflation is growing between, 6 and 8 or 10%. 8% compounded 10 years or 5 years is a completely different number than 6% compounded 5 years, right? So the odds that you can project forward 5 years, in my opinion, is very near zero. So why are you expected to make these kinds of projections and use that as the basis for decision making, which means that you're starting in the wrong place before you decide anything? And then the remaining 3 was, they said that their principles were transparency, equality or equity, and efficiency. We said we agree about transparency, no problem. But when it comes to efficiency and equity, we have some objections. In efficiency, we have good objections and bad objections, that is positive and negative. In part of that efficiency, they were supposed to exclude what was supposed to be populist schemes. We said, how do you define what is a populist scheme? I've just given you a lengthy explanation that not all freebies are the same. So who is an unelected team of 5 members to decide whether a scheme framed by a government of elected representatives is populist or not? So we said, when you look at efficiency, you don't get to make these kind of qualitative judgments of which should be included, which should not be included. In the reverse side, if the goal of efficiency is allocate the money in such a way that you get the greatest net uplift of Indian society and citizens, then the last 6 or 8 finance commissions have not done such a fantastic job, because you've kept on skewing the allocation of resources away from developed states to underdeveloped states, and you have kept on having the gap widen. In most other societies and countries, in China, in America, in Europe, if federalism requires the transfer of funds from the better off to the less well off, you find that the gap closes. You do that for a sustained period of time, and any measure, per capita income, human development index, whatever measure you take, the gap closes. That's what the transfers are supposed to do. It makes it a more equitable society. But in India, in fact, it hasn't. It has exacerbated. It keeps on getting wider and wider. So you are not achieving your goals of efficiency. Maybe you should be looking at different measures and different leading indicators, because the final outcomes will take years to manifest. So maybe you should be looking at things like extent of women's participation in education, in the workforce, in politics, which are well-established leading indicators of, then declining birth rates, and then increasing output, and then increasing kind of societal, development indicators and so forth. And then finally, when it comes to equity or equality or fairness, if you will, we said 100% of this talks about how to divide the pool. Vertical to horizontal, meaning central government to states collectively, and then individually which state. Nowhere do you talk about input to output fairness, right? You have not even mentioned where these funds come from. By definition, these funds are collected by the central government through taxes and cesses and surcharges from around the country. They don't, drop from heaven. So surely there must be some consideration of where the money comes from relative to where it is given to. You can't keep on taking from those who give it and then keep on, not sending the money back. So at the end of all of that, I said, Combine the fact that you are not capable of projecting 5 years forward. I say so. I say that you cannot accurately project 5 years forward, number one. Number two, there must be some relationship between input and output. Fairness requires it. If you put these two together, I say that what you should recommend for a change is an innovative way of allocation. One more thing. The government, central government randomly puts in cesses and surcharges whenever it wants, and there's no constitutional bar to that. And, in recent years, it has been collecting 1.5 to 2.5 lakh crores a year in cesses and surcharges. Now, as you know, the cesses and surcharges don't go into the divisible pool. They get 100% held by the center, supposedly to achieve specific targets like toilet building or, Krish Kalyan or whatever the names are. But the central government has never been able to achieve those targets. So they collect the money and neither can they execute because those targets cannot be achieved by central government prowess. They are subjects of the state, which means that you have to end up then splitting the money again to the states to do the work. Then why do you put it in a separate, indivisible pool? Just to give yourself the flexibility to decide where you'll send the money. Just think about it this way. If the project can only be done by the state, why do you collect it in a separate cess? You just throw it into the total revenue pool and let the states take the money and do it. Now you direct them when you give the grant, you say this grant is only for toilets. This grant is only for, clean housing, whatever it is, right? Sewage development, sewage treatment development. But instead of that, you say that you're going to set it up in a separate pool, and then you're not able to execute from that pool. So there's these three issues. So in fact, we didn't press it that much, but the CPM, Mr. T.K. Rangarajan, the Rajya Sabha MP said, we should abolish all cesses. The central government should not have the right to do surcharges and cesses. They either take it as direct taxes or indirect taxes or stop. You cannot exclude money from the pool. Whatever money must go into the pool. And then we said on behalf of the DMK, we said, instead of having a fixed formula, have a variable formula. You just design the formula for us. You say the allocation will be based on this multiplier times this performance indicator, plus this multiplier times this performance indicator, whatever that is, per capita GDP, women's participation in education, percentage of girls enrolled in school, whatever it is. You pick those indicators and leave it as a floating formula. And in that floating formula, put up a floor and a cap. A floor says that no state should get back less than X% of the taxes it paid in. That's fairness. And a cap says no state should get more than X times the taxes it paid in. Again, that's fairness. Now, because of the way math works, and because large numbers, are significantly different kind of ratios than small numbers, for example, it is mathematically feasible that those cap and floor could be widely disparate. That is to say, you can say no state should get back less than 33% of the money it put in, or 40% of the money it put in, and simultaneously say that no state should get back more than 3 times the money or 4 times the money it put in, because the states that are poor are putting in so little that 4x theirs is less than 2/3 what I'm not getting back. You see what I'm saying? So the math works actually in our favor. So you could have equity and still have. So I said, if you have a floating formula with a floor and a cap, taking into consideration input, not just output, then you have a much more fair and equitable distribution.
So one problem that I see is that there is okay, let me rephrase. One of the concerns that I have with your, the solution that you have proposed, while I completely agree that it will work mathematically, I suspect the Finance Commission is unlikely to accept it simply because it doesn't suit the politics of North India. And if we look at why it doesn't suit the politics of North India, we can see from the birth rate data and from the fertility data and from their literacy rates of women from the ages 15 to 24, like women who are in the prime age of going to give birth. Like, for instance, they have rest of much of Bihar, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, all these states have double-digit sort of female illiteracy amongst girls who are in the ages of 15 to 24. And in states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, they're like upwards of 30%. And the ratio of their population, which is under the age of 15, and these girls are again going to, become mothers very soon, is like upwards of 30%, right? Whereas those numbers, if you see for states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, like Kerala has 22% of its population under the age of 15, and it basically has almost no girl child who is illiterate. In Tamil Nadu's case, it is about 25% of the population is under 15, and like 1% of all its girls in this age group are illiterate. So the point I'm trying to make is, these numbers are already cooked in. We cannot change that for the next 30 to 50 years. Does that worry you? Does that worry you in terms of this divergence being, while the demographic destiny is sort of cooked in, we are arguing about the policy in terms of politics, and I suspect your solution is not even going to get implemented. So how do you see this?
No, I mean, of course, it worries me tremendously, right? It should worry anybody who can do mathematics and project forward, right? And who has access to this data. But actually, your argument for why it is not politically palatable is the biggest motivation, I would say, why it has to be done. In the sense that if you don't do it, in fact, the concluding line of my submission on behalf of the party was that unless you put in some kind of system like this, you are going to reach a stage where the ratio of putting in to getting out becomes simply intolerable, unpalatable, right? And at that point, you're going to have serious questions like of the integrity of the country, right? At some point, people are going to step back and say, look, what's in it for me? I keep putting in 10 and getting back 1. At some point, this is no longer palatable, right? And again, I say, it would be palatable if putting in 10 and getting back 1 was a temporary solution that led to the other people coming up, so that eventually the trend was going backwards, that I put in 10 and get back now 5, because everybody's uplift brings us back. But given the data we have today, the spread is going only one direction. Not only is it going one direction, it's accelerating in one direction. So if you look at Tamil Nadu, for example, in the 10th Finance Commission in 1994, our allocation was 6.7 or 6.8%. Then it kept dropping, and now we're at 4.03 or something like that, right? If that trend continues, this year, this Finance Commission is likely to recommend something with a 3 handle, not even a 4 handle. Whereas our contribution to taxes is depending on, and the government purposely doesn't publish this data with great clarity, but depending on which estimate you take, or even using percentage of the country's GDP, which is Tamil Nadu's GSDP as a rough approximation, is somewhere north of 8.5%. So at some point I say, listen, why am I keeping on paying in 8-10% of the total and getting back from 6 to 4 to 3 to 2 to, at some point it becomes unpalatable. So all I said was that unless you do something like this, where you start giving weightage to the input and you start having some floor and cap limitations, you will not be in you will not be helping the cause of integration of the country. You will be helping the cause of, vociferous tendencies that say, listen, at some level, this is just loot. You keep on taking my money, I get nothing for it, and you're not able to make any part of the country better. It's one thing if you took the money and you actually achieved the outcome. I gave the speech somewhere else at the endowment lecture, and I said, we are second to none as citizens of India in Tamil Nadu in wanting our fellow citizens to progress and develop and be healthy and happy and productive. We have no problem. But if we keep sending money and getting less and less back, and that gap is not showing any results, right? If when in the European Union you took money from the Germanys, Frances of the world and gave it to the Spains, kind of Portugals of the world, they converged.
Right.
In the US, you take money from the Californias, New Yorks of the world, and you give it to the North Dakotas, Montanas of the world. The standard of living, the quality of development converges. In China, the coastal provinces are net contributors, and the hinterland is net receivers. The quality of life, and it's not equal, but it converges. In India, it keeps on diverging. And if it keeps diverging, at what point do we consider that this is not a working solution, right? So either you produce results or you stop wasting the money and it's not as if we are like so great. It's not like we're living at $40,000 per capita that we are so well off that we can afford to keep giving up our revenue for no return, right?
So this is a question that I have been asked quite often, and therefore I looked into all these societies that you mentioned. Let's take the US, where states like Alabama or states in the Appalachian South or in the Mountain West, these were generally poor. But the difference is people from those states go into New York and California, and if you see the population of these states, it is the well-performing states whose population is increasing. Same with Europe, like Spain's fertility rate is 1.3, like it's whereas the population of Germany and Britain and even to a lesser extent France is like they're slightly higher on a higher trajectory. And India is probably the only society in such a structure where the poorer regions which are receiving assistance are actually creating population growth by virtue of greater fertility rate, as opposed to migration being a cause of...
No, that's actually, yeah, I'm not 100% sure how much of it I can separate as fertility or migration in other parts of the world, but I completely take your point. Let's even forget the delta perspective. Let's take the static perspective. In China, the coastal provinces that are the greatest economic producers are also the most populous because people have migrated there. In America, California and New York are not just the greatest GDP states, they're also the highest population states. So you're right. In that sense, India is a very unique situation because the highest population states are the poorest states. In most societies, the concept of a federal society is that there is unrestricted movement of goods, labor, manpower, capital, etc., which means that if there is a dichotomy where there are some places where there's opportunity and quality of life and some places where there's not, people will tend to migrate. In fact, within Tamil Nadu, we can see that. There's a huge disparity in Tamil Nadu relative to Tamil Nadu standards, not relative to India standards, between urban and rural GDP or quality of life. Not so in health and education, thankfully, but in some other ways, like infrastructure in terms of plumbing, sewage, etc., or per capita GDP or availability of industrial jobs or white-collar jobs, things like that. So, in a totally fungible space, which a country is supposed to be, a country under one constitution is supposed to be completely fungible, that anybody can go anywhere, then the system would have kind of brought itself into equilibrium. There would have been net migration to those places where opportunity occurred or grew or existed and not. So India is very unique because we have this really exceptional situation, as you say, where the highest population, static, plus dynamically highest growing populations are in the poorest states because of we have not yet crossed that point where birth rates, in the history of the world, birth rates moderate after economic development, and the greater the economic development, the lower the birth rates. That's well-known demographic pattern all over the world. So we've not crossed that. My question is, how do we get over that? Now, part of that is, for example, I've just come back from a seminar in Delhi on job creation in India. That was what it was titled. And speaker after speaker told us that the country is so diverse and so vast that there are no nationwide problems and there are no nationwide solutions. In fact, there may not even be statewide problems and statewide solutions. There would have to be regional problems with regional solutions, because we are not, as the economist once put it, we are a continent masquerading as a country, either by scale of people or by landmass or the variability in its deep and long history and culture. We are a country on paper. In practical terms, we are quite disparate in every measure, from historical differences to language differences to developmental differences to education level differences to human development index differences to per capita differences. So a lot of these solutions need to be local, right? Now again, incidentally, this was one of the great principles of the Justice Party going back 100 years, was local self-governance. The amount of power that the Madras Presidency government delegated to the district boards and the district chairman was phenomenal, and it was done in their time. They pushed as much power down as possible. So the future of a country of our size has to be greater and greater federalism. We need to start pushing from taxation to spending to policy decisions closer and closer to the people. You cannot sit in Delhi and administer 1.3 million people. I have just been saying that in a slightly different way in politics. I said, in my mind, there is no truly national party in India left today. Even the BJP, for all its money, for all its infrastructure, for all its support from the RSS, is barely in 18 or 17 states. Now, you can buy positions, on the run while you're in power and when the money is flowing. But, realistically, they have infrastructure in 17 or 18 states, not 29 by any stretch of the imagination, right? For example, in Tamil Nadu, they have been irrelevant, and they are irrelevant today. You would have thought that if it was doable, in 4 years, they could have built an infrastructure with a fantastic insight and everything. The Congress is even worse off because the Congress's infrastructure and governance and organizational talent is less than the BJP's. So they are probably in 10 to 14 states. People like us struggle in 1 or 2 states, right? Because we have not paid enough attention to organizational infrastructure and design and work ethic and things like that. So India has now reached a scale where I think scientists would agree, politicians have to face the reality, and the problems have reached the complexity where there cannot be easy national one-size-fits-all solutions. The answer must be in greater and greater devolution of powers, including taxation, revenue generation and spending, further and further down the spectrum, all the way down to the local bodies, I mean the corporations and the village panchayats.
That brings me to the until Ms. Jayalalitha was around, at least, the ADMK used to oppose the centralization of, let's say, the National Food Security Act, the Uday scheme, the GST even. All these were looked at as assault on the federal structure. Right now, the ADMK government has signed on to everything that she had opposed. The DMK's position on GST was always it was always in favor of it, but for a uniform rate, I suppose. So, given that there is, you've laid out the problem in terms of how there cannot be one size fits all. However, the politics and the policy of the country is going towards overt centralization, and this is the point where one is forced to ask: do you already see the vociferous tendencies creeping up, or is it the role of the politician to basically say, the way in which we will solve these problems is through these long-term policy propositions like you have just laid out? And my follow-up question to that is that the reason why there are a whole lot of Tamil nationalist parties out there which are gaining traction? The DMK, for instance, in my own workplace, is the young people who are in their 20s are gravitating towards people who are more militant, so to speak. Do you see that as a problem for your own politics, and do you see that as a problem for the country as a whole?
Well, being an active politician and sitting in opposition, I don't want to, kind of debase this discussion by going on a political slant. But I'll say a few things. I will say, and I've said this publicly on TV, we may have had many political differences with Ms. Jayalalitha, even with Mr. MJR. And I say we, though I'm only new in politics because of my legacy. I'm a multi-generation, long-term kind of DMK guy in my existence. But I think it's fair to say that we never expected how bad things would get in her absence, right? Whatever the difference is, nobody could argue she was a talented woman, she was a capable woman, she was, the match of anybody in any field in many ways. I would argue that the data suggests she was not nearly as good an administrator as தலைவர் Kalaignar. But then I would also have to probably concede that she was a better authoritarian, disciplinarian party leader and managed, a ragtag bunch more effectively than anybody else in recent politics. But in her void, the real tragedy, and it's beyond politics, the tragedy is that we don't see any voices that have any fundamental views from a policy or principle perspective. I mean, the wheels keep moving. The direction is sometimes coming from Delhi, sometimes by random, sometimes it hits a stone and takes a turn. I have sat in the assembly for 2-3 years now, and ever since the absence of Ms. Jayalalitha, I have not found a cohesive vision for what this government stands for, what are they for, what are they against, why do they do what they do. I had an unexpected chance to speak on the governor's address debate earlier this year, and I said, this is a farce. I pick up this book and it has schemes listed for 2 crores, 5 crores, 10 crores, I did this, I'm going to do that. So the budget of the state is 2,30,000 crores. Surely in a policy address at the beginning of the year, surely you should be talking about fundamental things. What am I going to do about groundwater management? What am I going to do about job creation? What am I going to do about fixing the educational system, which on the one hand is throwing out all these underqualified graduates. On the other hand, Tamil Nadu accounts for 40% of all student loan growth in India. Surely many of them are going to turn bad, right? You have not talked about what you say in your own policy statement somewhere else, that the state is 48% urbanized and is going on track to 75% in 2026. Okay, we are a less than replacement rate society. That means if the net population is not increasing that much, you're saying wherever there are 2 people now in the cities and 2 people in the villages, there's going to be 3 people in the cities and 1 person in the village. What are the implications of that for village life? What are the implications of that for city life? I represent a 100% urban constituency. We are not able to get water in, take sewage out, get food and supplies in, get garbage out, or provide safe traffic and infrastructure for the existing 2 residents. How are we going to do this for 3? Before we can build infrastructure, the demand goes up. But before the sewer lines are opened, they're clogged. The volume is going to clog them. So what is your policy on all these? And every year you neglect this. You just exacerbate the problem when you finally deal with it. So I would say, the depressing thing about this last couple of years since the passing of Ms. Jayalalitha is, whatever her other limitations, she understood enough to know what were the issues and how to deal with them. And I'm sad to say, politics apart, I have not yet seen any sign in this government, not from the bureaucrats, not from the ministers, not from any kind of document laid on the house, that they have a vision for how to address these fundamental problems and how we're going to deal with this. Now, going the other way, surely, the level of frustration of people goes up when they don't see light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, you look at what happened in Sri Lanka. I was there the year before the trouble started, and it was already on the kind of boiling point. This was probably 1980-81. And then, you just saw what happened. And that was like after 10 or 15 years of bad government policy, excluding Tamils from jobs, limiting their educational opportunities, forcing, vernacular education so that people couldn't get English education and couldn't be qualified to do work. So, 10 or 15 years of lousy government discriminatory policies then blew up. And then it took 20, 30 years. Not that it's 100% resolved now, but it became a long problem. So, history teaches us that either you deal with these problems when you have a chance, or they will become problems that manifest themselves on you in ways that you cannot control or manage, right? It's human nature. Now, I don't want to be alarmist. It's not like there's going to be blood on the streets revolution, next year or 5 years from now. But I have been to many parts of the world. I'll give a very clear example of Venezuela. And I'm talking Venezuela 15, 20 years ago, before it got as bad as it is now. Even 15 years ago in Venezuela, you probably were better off with somebody actually riding shotgun with a shotgun, sitting in the front seat next to your driver if you were going out, after dark. Right? Now, in my opinion, the longer we allow both societal and economic kind of disparity or unfairness or perceptions of no hope, no voice, no input to permeate the youth, the greater the problem. Again, history teaches us that the one critical kind of catalyst for revolution is a large number of educated, unemployed youth. Right? Every single revolution in the history of the world has had that as the key ingredient. And we are churning out so-called educated people at a much exponentially higher rate now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Not only has the population increased, the number of educational institutions has increased, and the accessibility has become universal. So, in Tamil Nadu today, I think if you wanted to go to college and you are not that particular about the quality of the college, I don't think there's anybody who wants to go to college who will not get admission in some college, right? And this is exactly the opposite of what it was 30 years ago when I went to college. So I think we are creating the conditions that will either be really helpful to us if we have good policy, or the conditions that are going to be really dangerous for us if we look at history and we have people who are educated without hope, without a voice, and with no kind of perspective that says that there is some future that is going to be better than today.
What do we do when what we have now is essentially elected dictatorship, right? The structure of our governance is such that, the DMK now has 89 MLAs, but at best, what the recourse in assembly is that you can stand up and basically point to the government how absurd it is, but the government doesn't do anything, and this isn't restricted to the DMK. I'm sure, even if the the shoe was in the other foot and the DMK were bad, similar things could happen. But the point I'm trying to ask you is, shouldn't we therefore have legislative reform of some sort, wherein these kinds of, if the government is as hopeless as you and I agree it is right now, shouldn't there be a recourse of some sort? And do you have any specific propositions for that?
Yeah, listen, again, I'd separate the two. I'd say it's rare in the history of Tamil Nadu that we have had such an inept and incompetent, in my opinion, government. But it's also a rare kind of occurrence where a sitting chief minister dies, within 6 months of election and so forth. So, of course, it's an extreme situation now. I'm not sure that I would extrapolate the policy needs of the country from an extreme situation. Sooner or later, this too shall pass. And we just have to be patient. I'm reminded that I'm not in investment banking anymore. Problems don't get fixed, because they get recognized. But you ask a more fundamental question, which is a deeply troubling question. And as I say again, I've just come back from this legislative seminar, which had 30-odd legislators who were from 13 or 14 states. And almost all of them had the view that the functioning of the assembly has become kind of on automaton mode, right? Again, I'll give you an example. In a normal governor's address, or let's take the Queen's address in the UK, equal number of ruling party MPs will get up and have a view on the Queen's address, because the Queen's address represents the elected cabinet's agenda for the year. They may say they want to focus on agriculture. I may come from an urban constituency and say, no, you shouldn't only focus on agriculture, you should also focus on, greenhouse farming in cities. And that is perfectly okay, because I'm here to talk mostly for my constituents, only secondarily for my party. It's okay for me to have a different agenda than the cabinet of my party. In India, that kind of dissent basically doesn't exist, right? And in India, it's very rare to find people who encourage that at several levels of leadership, right? And again, whatever Ms. Jayalalitha's positives, and there were many, one of her faults was that she would not brook any kind of individuality or raising your head or turning to the side or doing. The images of the genuflecting are vivid in our memory. So, to that extent, in my understanding, Talaivar was spectacularly kind of broad-minded in the sense that he would take input from anybody and everybody. And as smart as he was, Talaivar Kalaignar would call 10 or 20 additional people and take input, And the big difference between Talaivar and Ms. Jayalalitha was that Ms. Jayalalitha formulated policy on her own or with 3 or 4 civil servants or whatever her private advisors were who nobody knew, and all the rest of them, nodded their head like sheep. Talaivar would actually take, conscious input from tens of people who would listen to, and he had a fantastic talent, which, I don't have certainly. If he asked for views, he would never betray whether he liked or disliked what you were saying or agreed or disagreed with what you were saying. So he got full, clear input, and he never said, that doesn't make any sense to me. What are you talking about? It's nonsense. And then he would formulate policy, then he would check it with 2-3 people. And now, that is a substitute for the fact that this debate really ought to happen in the assembly. You ought to stand up and do this debate. But even there, I will give an example. In the 96 to 2001 DMK government, when my father was Speaker of the Assembly, ADMK had 4 MLAs. Congress had 40-50, and the DMK had many. But because of the way the coalition worked, there was virtually no opposition. And Talaivar ensured that the assembly met 52 days a year. I mean, you are an overwhelming majority. The opposition is 4 out of 243. Ms. Jayalalitha did not win her own seat, right? And yet the assembly met 52 days a year. I'm not saying spectacular, but compare that 52 days a year to, here we have the highest ever opposition members in the assembly. 89 of us plus our coalition partners, 98. Now if you take out the disqualified members, we are close to 48-49% of the assembly. And the assembly barely has met for 30 or 32 days a year for the last 2 years. There has not been a single day it has met if it was not for the governor's address, the budget, the demand for grants, or the confidence motion. It has not even met one day just for the sake of discussing bills or debating a law proposal or anything. So democracy in that sense, the legislative system is effectively dead. You're right. Once you form a kind of ruling party, and this is not unique to Tamil Nadu, I'm saying Tamil Nadu is a more progressive state. If that is the case in Tamil Nadu, you can imagine what it is in Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or some place like that. So all these MLAs, actually the 32, 33 MLAs across party lines, across all states, bemoan the fact that legislative kind of democracy is in sore need of a fundamental kind of rejuvenation, right? That it practically doesn't exist, that there is no real debate, that there is no real kind of, policy setting. That most legislators are reduced to rubber stamps. And that, I remember the comment one of them made. He said the anti-defection bill is the bane of democracy, right? Is that you have now been reduced to, the law says that you cannot go against your party. And you just have to nod your head when they say yes, right? If you don't like it, they issue a whip, you still have to say yes, right? So I think, I hope that over time there will be, structural reform.
Would you consider some form of direct, because we don't have referendums in this country, would that act as a counterweight? It has its own set of problems, but do you consider that as a counterweight, or do you consider sort of secret ballot within the assembly as a counterweight? Would you consider these options, or would you just say that doing away with the anti-defection law and allowing for legislators to just stand up and risk? Because I assume the even if you take out the anti-defection law, if somebody wants a ministerial position within their party, they're probably not going to offend their party leadership. So there is that inbuilt problem, right? Like, so which one would you prefer?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm so new to the system. I can identify, and when I hear it from others, it resonates with me that this is a countrywide problem, and this is true of all legislatures. I think it is less so in the parliament to some extent. Partly because I think, with the exception of this Lok Sabha, which is simple majority, for the last 20-25 years, we have had a kind of coalition government with many parties in the ruling, many parties in the majority, and therefore enabling at least a party-to-party difference within the ruling coalition. I am very clear that it needs structural reform. I'm also pretty clear, at the risk of offending, others, that many MLAs today are not capable of operating in an ideal system, right? In fact, I made the observation to a friend of mine that the attributes and assets required to get elected as an MLA in today's political, environment have very little overlap with the attributes and assets that are required of a good legislator. Right? Understanding of policy, ability to debate, ability to absorb and process information. The amount of information the government supplies you is tremendous. Most people don't even pick up that information and take it home and read it. The government does its own bad work. Sometimes it produces the bill. There's a rule in most assemblies and the parliament that you cannot vote on a bill the same day it is introduced. But if you look at the Tamil Nadu Assembly, many, many, many times, I would say 75% of the bills that have been passed since I've been an MLA are only dropped on the desk this morning or sent to our house last night. Then they pass a motion because of their majority, waiving the normal rules that you can't introduce and pass on the same day, and then they pass the bill. So if I had to take a bet as an ex-trader, I would say less than 25% of the MLAs have actually read the bill that is passed. Whatever the bill is, when the speaker says, because the government has introduced the bill, in my 2.5 years, there's never been a private member bill. So of the government bills that have come, once the speaker says who votes for it, obviously every ruling party guy says yes, right? So, and then it doesn't matter what we say, it's a majority vote. It doesn't matter whether it passes as, 120 to 5 or 120 to 115, it still passes. So most people, in my understanding, don't actually read the bill before they pass it. Now, is that a fault of the system? Is that a fault of the process that brings these people to the system? Is that a fault of, the evolution of politics over the last 20 years? It's hard for me to say. But the system is broken.
Isn't this where a lot of people would place criticism on the political parties themselves, be it the ADMK or the DMK? The way in which the threshold for entry into politics has been raised to such a level that there are only very few people who can afford to get in, either with money or powers otherwise. And that, had you had a primary system or things of that nature elsewhere, like regular people who will do these things would probably have come into the system. Has politics evolved to such a way that they restrict people who would, have read and been good legislators? And is this a chicken and egg problem is what I'm trying to ask you.
Yeah, so I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. So I'll tell you what, but yesterday by coincidence I was at the Bloomberg ACJ Financial Journalist Program at the Asian College of Journalism. And somebody asked me, says, sir, I want to enter politics, but it's very hard. What do you think? And I said, actually, the primary reason I'm in politics, going back to your first question, yes, of course, I have my legacy. Yes, I want to continue. I owe it to my forefathers. I owe it to the system. I owe it to the movement. I owe it to the future generations. But at the end of the day, by God's grace, my life was very well organized. Forget academics. I was a senior managing director in a large global bank. I was, certainly in the top, point something percent of earners and quality of life guys. And the final decider that I had to come to politics was that I had a ramp already built. And the odds of another guy like me having an entry ramp were close to zero. So I start with the fact that you said, which is that the barriers to entry are high, almost infinitely high and unsurmountable. And then there was a guy like me who, despite being away for 30 years in many countries, doing different things, studying different things, I had this ramp. And so in the final analysis, I couldn't my conscience wouldn't let me sleep at night if I didn't take that ramp, precisely because there are many people who are as driven or more driven than me and as talented or more talented than me who would like to contribute to the country through this avenue. You can contribute in many ways, but through the avenue of public service and politics and elections, who simply don't get the chance. And so, though it was a relatively small opportunity cost for me, a quiet and comfortable and luxurious life away from the spotlight, and people underestimate the price of the spotlight, right? So though I sacrificed those things, which in the scheme of life both I was blessed to have, and they were minor sacrifices, I simply couldn't afford to not do it because the barriers are so high, because if I didn't do it, I wasn't sure when the next guy like me would have a chance, right? So both ways, meaning A, I had to do it, otherwise it was a wasted opportunity to make an impact. B, if not me, it was not clear when the next guy like me would have had this opportunity. But in the same speech I said, but that is changing dramatically. I said that, and that change is coming more in Tamil Nadu than anywhere else. I said as little as 10 years from now, I think we're going to be in a different scenario. We're clearly at the end of one era. Anybody who has observed politics for any length of time will say that the passing of Talaivar and Ms. Jayalalitha certainly marks the end of an era, right? They have kind of straddled the political scene for at least the day since the death of Mr. MJR, which was in 80 something, right? 87 or 88. So if you add that to the 3 or 4 other variables I'm going to tell you, which is that the percentage of college-educated youth has exploded. The percentage of youth as a percentage of, the percentage of youth as a function of total voting population has exploded, because the belly of the high growth years, high birth years have now come to voting age. And the connectivity has exploded, right? I was talking to a vendor from one of the big kind of internet companies, and they were telling me that something like 3.5 crore distinct individuals in Tamil Nadu are accessing the net. Right?
That's half the population. Right?
Yeah, and that's like more than half the voter population, right? And that is phenomenal. And of course, recent events, meaning the last 2-3 years, the geos, the competition introduced by the geo has changed the world dramatically, right? So I think, change is happening much more rapidly than most people realize, which is always the case, right? When you're in the midst of something, you can't understand it. I was giving this example that I was in the North Tower when the 9/11 accident, 9/11 terrorist incident happened. And I had come out of the basement about 3 minutes after the first plane hit. I knew there was something wrong, but I had no idea what it was. I tried to go this way, I tried to go that way. It's a different long story, but literally it took me about 20 minutes after the second plane hit, which I didn't see because I was inside the building. I could just see the smoke and the light, to realize they were commercial planes and not small Cessnas, and that it was a coordinated, because till the second plane hit, even the guy was standing next to me, other Lehman employee, said he thought the first one was an accident. You see how the brain works, right? He sees the second one coming in and he says, man, that plane's coming really close considering we already had one accident. It never occurred to him that the first plane was a conscious attack, right? So when you are in your environment, you can't see change happening all around you, because your field of vision is not both, from granular to 30,000 and, infinite wide perspective. But, people like me who are relatively new to the system, whose job, because I had the IT wing for the DMK, is to look at data and build infrastructure and start talking to vendors and look for communication channels and stuff like that. If I put all of this together, I would say that we are in a transformative phase. It's always the case in the technology business, the classic S-curve theory of, technology slowly evolves, it accelerates, it matures, and as it dies, the next one comes. And the end of one S-curve and the beginning of the other S-curve is always a highly volatile era. We don't know which new technology, we don't know which new direction. We know change is upon us, but we don't know how fast, and we don't know which direction that change is going to take us. So we are at that level of, the evolution. It is clearly the end of an era. It is clearly the beginning of a new era. Precisely what direction that era will take and what that means, I don't know. But I know generally it must lead to a fundamental transformation in the nature of politics, because we have everything changing at the same time. It's not the same leadership. It's not the same voter. It's not the same communication channel. And it's not the same issues. So when you have that much flux in the system, it's an indicator of change. So I told the young man, I said, maybe in 10 years it'll be different. Maybe in 10 years you can enter politics, without having kind of an on-ramp like I did, where the leader, was gracious enough to give me an opportunity based on my legacy and so forth. And I think of the lot of change that I said, communication is going to be the biggest change, because what you don't think about is what does a party really do for you? A party gives you infrastructure, gives you a platform, gives you a built-in kind of vote share, gives you a built-in distribution mechanism, right? That's needed when you have to do it a human way. If I'm in America and I can reach with technology anybody I want and target it, sometimes using kind of known methods, sometimes unknown methods, then you can have a Donald Trump come out of nowhere, never even been like a counselor in New York, to president one day. You can look at all the upsets that are happening in the primaries in the US now, right? Completely new faces, just shaking up the system, right? So the party infrastructure gets less and less valuable. The party's platform gets less and less valuable as technology penetrates. And I think we're in that transition now.
That has been a conversation that I both enjoyed and gave me a lot of reasons to worry. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and patient conversation. We also wish you the very best. We hope to see you in a ministerial position very soon, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.